He hadn't opened that door in years. Not since the night everything he loved slipped away in silence, but tonight, someone was knocking. And she wasn't just asking for shelter. She was about to change everything. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. Just stood there holding on to a baby that hadn't yet been born, and hope that had no reason left to exist. He told himself it was just one night, just a couch, just a kindness. But some promises aren't made with words. They're made with who you let stay. From ashes came something fragile. From silence, a lullaby. And in the cracks of an old life, a new one quietly grew. He didn't need to be her father. She didn't need to be his second chance. But every morning they stayed. They chose each other. Again. If quiet stories of love, healing, and second chances speak to you, stay with us. Like, subscribe, and come see how a single knock became a new beginning. Fairbrook, Appalachia, late October. The rain had been falling for hours. It wasn't the kind of rain that made you want to stay in bed, but the kind that felt personal, cold, deliberate, and just heavy enough to remind you that something in the world had gone wrong. James Lawson stood in the dim light of his kitchen, holding a chipped coffee mug with both hands. The warmth barely reached through his calloused fingers. He wasn't drinking it. Hadn't planned to. He just needed to hold something. The old radiator hummed faintly in the corner, but it never quite won the battle against the Appalachian cold. The house, like James, was quiet, worn, and just functional enough to keep surviving. He liked it that way. Ever since the accident 3 years ago, the one that took Allison, the only person who had ever truly known how to speak into the silence, inside him, James had stopped expecting anything from the world. The garage paid the bills. The house kept the rain off his back. The silence. Well, that was the safest part. He hadn't spoken to anyone since noon. He rarely did after sunset. That's why the sound caught him off guard. A knock, soft. 2 taps. Hesitant. He froze, eyes narrowing toward the front door. No one came to visit him, not at night, not in this town. The second knock was louder, then followed by a voice, barely audible over the rain. Please. I just need somewhere to sit for a bit. He set the mug down. Something in his gut clenched. Not fear exactly. Instinct. Old, rusted concern trying to rattle back to life. James walked to the door, hand brushing the scar on his shoulder as if it still needed protection. The porch light flickered once, then held steady, and there she was. A girl, no, young woman, stood soaked beneath the overhang. Her hair clung to her face in damp ribbons, and her coat was clearly too thin for the season. But what James noticed, first wasn't the cold or the dripping suitcase at her feet. It was the way she was holding her belly. She was pregnant, 7, maybe 8 months, alone, and trying not to look afraid. Just until the rain stops, she said again, her voice raw. I don't have anywhere else. James stared at her. The part of him that had been scorched by loss, that had built this silence like armor, screamed to shut the door. Too risky, too complicated. Too human. But something else, something that had once been a husband, maybe even a father, took a breath. He stepped aside. Couch is there, he said, voice rough with disuse. Don't touch anything. She didn't thank him. She just walked in slowly, her body stiff from cold, the bag dragging behind her. She didn't ask questions, didn't look around. Just made her way to the couch, sat down carefully, and wrapped her arms around herself like she was holding something fragile inside her, like she was the shell of something trying to stay whole. James closed the door, locked it. Then he stood there in the dim light of the hallway, staring at this stranger who'd cracked open his solitude like it was nothing more than an old door with a broken latch. Name? He asked finally, more out of habit than interest. She looked up. Her eyes were the color of river silt, clouded, unreadable. Rosie. He nodded once. That was enough. James retreated to the kitchen, though he didn't sit. He just stood by the counter listening. She didn't make a sound. Just the occasional shift of fabric, the soft hitch in her breath when the baby moved, maybe. He poured the coffee down the drain. The silence wasn't the same anymore. An hour passed. The rain didn't let up. James paced once, then settled in the recliner, across from the couch. Rosie was curled up now, already asleep or pretending to be. Her coat was hung over the armrest to dry. Her shoes neatly placed by the front mat. She hadn't touched anything else. James watched her for a long moment. Her face, half shadowed in the warm lamplight, looked younger when she slept. Less haunted. But the lines around her mouth, the way she slept with one hand on her belly, told him she'd seen more than any girl her age should have had to. He wanted to feel angry at whoever had left her like this. But anger was dangerous. It could break things he couldn't fix anymore. Instead, he reached over to the small side table and turned the lamp down. The room dimmed to a golden hush. Outside, the rain began to slow. Inside, the old walls held a new kind of silence. One that didn't feel like loneliness, but something else. Not comfort. Not yet. But maybe. Maybe the start of something different. Something human. James woke before the sun. He always did. His body had learned long ago that nothing good happened after 5 a.m. No calls worth answering. No dreams worth finishing. Most days, he simply rose, brewed strong coffee, and let the silence settle in like dust on the windowsill. But this morning was not like most mornings. From the moment he opened his eyes, something felt uneven. He sat up, joints cracking as they did every morning, and listened. It wasn't the creak of the house or the distant hum of rain. Those were familiar sounds, worn into the rhythm of his life. No, this was quieter, softer. A presence. He walked into the living room, half expecting it all to have been a dream. But there she was, still curled up on the couch where he'd left her, one arm over her belly, the other tucked beneath her cheek. The blanket had slipped halfway to the floor. She hadn't left. James stood for a while, watching her chest rise and fall beneath the faded quilt. Something about her seemed smaller in the daylight. Vulnerable in a way he hadn't let himself acknowledge last night. He looked at the duffel bag on the floor, still zipped, untouched. Maybe she thought he'd throw her out if she moved. He didn't know what to feel about that. He walked into the kitchen, made coffee, 1 cup, out of habit. He stood by the sink, staring at the steam rising from the mug, trying to convince himself this was temporary. A glitch in the system. She'd wake up, thank him, and disappear down the road like a page torn from someone else's story. But then came the sound of soft footsteps, bare feet on old wood. He turned. Rosie stood in the kitchen doorway, holding her coat closed over her swollen belly. She looked uncertain, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to speak. "Sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to sleep so long." James shook his head once. "It's all right." She shifted, glancing around the room. "Do you want me to go?" The question sat between them for a beat too long. James looked down into his coffee, then back at her. She was trembling. From cold or fear, he couldn't tell. "You eat?" he asked instead. She blinked. "No." He pulled out a chair. "Sit. I'll fix something." Her shoulders relaxed just slightly as she lowered herself into the seat, wincing as she moved. He cracked a couple of eggs into the pan, hands moving without thought. He hadn't cooked for anyone else in years. The skillet hissed. The smell of butter filled the kitchen. Rosie sat silent, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. Not prying, not making small talk. Just there. When he set the plate in front of her, she looked surprised. Like the meal had been meant for someone else. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded. They ate in silence. Not the awkward kind, more like the kind between two people who didn't want to break something fragile by speaking too loud. Afterward, she helped clean the dishes without being asked. James watched her dry the plate he'd handed her. Her movements were careful, precise. as if doing something well was the only way she knew how to repay the space she was taking. He didn't know why that bothered him so much. "You got somewhere to be?" he asked finally. Rosie paused. "Nowhere that would take me back." James studied her. She didn't flinch, didn't beg. "I can go," she added. "I know this isn't. I don't want to be a burden." He wanted to say yes. He needed to say it. Keep the boundary. Keep her out. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, what came was a memory of Allison standing in this very kitchen on a morning not so different, hair still wet from the shower, smiling at him like she had no idea she'd be gone 3 weeks later. That same memory that always felt too tender to hold. James looked at Rosie again. So different, but somehow she brought the silence to life. Not by filling it, but by sharing it. "You can stay," he said at last. His voice was low, firm, like it had taken all his strength just to push the words out. Rosie blinked. "Just for today, I mean, just until you—" "Stay," he repeated, "till you figure things out." She nodded slowly, eyes glassy with something unspoken, and for a brief moment James looked away because something in his chest had tightened, and he didn't know what to do with that. Later that day, he found himself clearing the guest room. Not much, just dusting. Moving the boxes of old clothes untouched since Allison died. He didn't know if Rosie would ever use the room. He wasn't even sure why he was doing it. But maybe, he thought, just maybe, not everything needed to stay closed. Maybe some doors, if opened carefully, could still let in light. Rosie stayed, not just for the day. By the time the October rain tapered off and the skies dried into a soft Appalachian gray, she was still there, quiet, careful, always waiting for the moment James would change his mind. But he didn't. He told himself it was temporary, a few days, a week maybe. Enough time for her to rest, to make some calls, to find her next stop. But each morning she was still there, barefoot in the kitchen, boiling water for tea, her hand resting absently on the curve of her belly. And somehow, it didn't feel like intrusion. It felt like habit. The kind of habit that didn't knock down walls, but gently leaned against them until they softened. James wasn't sure when he started noticing the little things. Like how she folded the dish towel the same way every night, corners lined up neat. Or how she hummed under her breath when she washed the dishes. Always the same tune, soft and circular, like a lullaby without words. The house was changing. Or maybe it was just waking up. The dining table that once held tools and unopened mail now held meals for two. The couch no longer looked like a waiting room chair, but a place someone had lived in. Even the walls, still faintly stained from years of disuse, felt warmer somehow, with the smell of baking cinnamon and soft footsteps that didn't belong to him. James had never been good at sharing space. After Allison died, the silence had become his version of peace. Predictable, empty, but safe. Now with Rosie around, it was different. The quiet wasn't gone. It had just shifted, turned into something shared. He found himself fixing things he'd ignored for years. Replacing the broken hinges on the back door, repairing the loose step on the porch. One afternoon, he patched a drafty window in the guest room even though Rosie hadn't said a word about it. She still slept on the couch. He offered the bed once and she declined with a polite smile. "I like being close to the front door," she said. "Makes me feel like I'm not imposing." He didn't press her, but that night, he left a folded quilt at the end of the couch. Without a word. She used it. It was a kind of rhythm they fell into. Him fixing, her softening the edges. She never tried to open up more than he allowed. And he didn't push her away. Most evenings they ate together. Simple meals. Eggs and toast. Soup from a can, sometimes with biscuits she learned to bake with shaky hands and a wrinkled recipe card she found in his drawer. She never asked who it belonged to. James never offered, but he watched her make them, watched the way her fingers, moved with purpose even though she clearly hadn't cooked much before. There was a kind of grace in how she learned things, as if every small task was a way of proving to herself that she was still worthy of existing. One morning she asked if she could sweep the porch. James shrugged. "If you want." The sight of her out there, sleeves rolled, belly round and stubborn, broom in hand, made something ache in his chest. Not pain, not sadness. Maybe something closer to grief, softened by gratitude. That afternoon he came home with a small rocking chair. Bought it at the thrift store near the diner. Didn't even know why, except that she'd looked at one in the window a few days earlier and he'd remembered. When he brought it in, he said nothing. Just left it beside the couch. Rosie's eyes glistened when she saw it, but she didn't cry. She ran her hand along the worn wood, then whispered, "Thank you." James just nodded. Thought it might be useful. That night she sat in it for hours, just rocking slowly, hands over her belly, eyes closed like she was memorizing the feeling of stillness. One evening the porch light flickered again, the same faulty wiring that had been ignored for years. James stood on the ladder with a screwdriver in hand while Rosie stood below holding the base. He glanced down. "You sure you should be out here?" "I'm fine," she said. "Just don't fall on me." He smirked. The first real one in a long time. When the bulb clicked into place and the light steadied, Rosie let out a breath. "Looks nice," she said. James stepped down. "Simple job." "Still," she said, brushing dust from his shoulder. "It matters." Her touch was light barely there, but it lingered, and James, standing in the glow of that porch light, realized something terrifying. He wasn't waiting for her to leave anymore. That night, when he walked past the living room, he paused at the couch. She was there, as always, rocking Eden in the chair now, singing that same wordless melody. The baby hadn't arrived yet, but Rosie spoke to her often now, one hand gently stroking the side of her belly as she whispered things only a mother could. James leaned against the doorway and watched. Rosie looked up, met his gaze and smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile that asked for anything. It was the kind of smile that said, "I see you. Thank you for letting me stay." And for the first time in a long time, James didn't look away. The first frost came early. James noticed it on the window pane before the sun was up, thin, spider-webbed crystals clinging to the corners of the glass. It reminded him of the kind of delicate lace Allison used to wear on Sundays, back when they still went to church and believed that things stayed whole if you loved them hard enough. Rosie was still asleep, curled up on the couch as usual, her breathing slow, rhythmic. The rocking chair beside her stood empty, facing the cold hearth like it was waiting for something. He moved quietly through the kitchen, careful not to wake her. Everything had become a ritual. How he opened the cupboard, how the kettle clicked into place, how the spoon tapped the edge of the cup. Life had settled into a pattern again. Not the same as before, but not unfamiliar either. He hadn't asked how long she planned to stay. She hadn't offered, and maybe that was the only agreement they needed. That morning she joined him at the kitchen table wearing an oversized flannel he hadn't seen since Allison passed. He said nothing about it. She just rubbed her belly absently and looked out the window. "You ever get used to the quiet here?" she asked. James shrugged. "I stopped noticing it, I guess." Rosie nodded slowly. "It's different from the kind I grew up with. That one felt like punishment. Yours feels more like choice." He glanced at her. Her eyes weren't asking for pity, just stating a fact, like maybe she was trying to understand him through the lens of her own silence. After breakfast, he found her sitting on the back steps, wrapped in a blanket, a mug of tea warming her hands. The sky was pale gray, the trees stripped bare. The yard smelled of earth and smoke. She looked like she belonged there, like the house had made room for her somehow. He sat beside her, careful to leave a space between them. It wasn't discomfort, it was reverence. She broke the silence first. I was 15 the first time he hit me. James didn't move. Rosie didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, like the words had been waiting years to find the air. He cried after, she said he loved me. Said it was my fault, but that he forgave me. And I believed him. James's hands curled into fists in his lap. Quietly, without show. After that, it got worse. But it was like every bruise just made me more sure I had to earn the good parts again. Like if I could just be better, he'd go back to how he was before. She laughed once, a sharp, hollow sound. Turns out there was no before, just a better mask. James wanted to say something, anything, but everything felt wrong, too big, too small, too late. I didn't even know I was pregnant until I'd already left, Rosie said. He threw me out after he found the test. My parents said it was God punishing me. My mother wouldn't look at me. James looked at her then. She was still staring forward, but her hands trembled slightly around the mug. And now there's a baby coming, and I'm terrified I won't know how to love her right. Her voice cracked on that last word. James exhaled, slow and deep. You being here, he said, in the cold, in someone else's house, trying to make something out of nothing. That already means you're loving her right. Rosie blinked once, then looked down. Sometimes I think she saved me, she whispered. Maybe, James said. Or maybe you saved each other. For a long time, they sat in silence. Then she asked softly, What about you? James didn't answer right away. He stared out at the leafless maple tree near the edge of the yard, the one he still hadn't brought himself to cut down even though it had died the same year Allison did. My wife, he said at last. Her name was Allison. She died 3 years ago. Car accident. I was driving. Rosie turned to him but didn't speak. It was raining, he continued. She told me to slow down. I didn't listen. Thought I knew the road. We hit black ice. He paused, jaw tight. She was gone before the ambulance came. I walked away with nothing but a scar, and too many chances to wish I hadn't. The frost had started to melt slowly in the corners of the grass. James looked down at his hands. I stopped letting anyone in after that. Stopped trusting myself to care for anything that could be lost. Rosie reached out, and without a word placed her hand gently over his. Not tightly, not asking for more, just present. It was the first time anyone had touched him like that since Allison. He didn't pull away. That night, James lit a fire in the hearth for the first time in years. They sat near it, not speaking much. Rosie rested her head on a pillow, one hand on her belly. James sat in his chair, a blanket over his lap, watching the flames flicker and dance in the old brick fireplace. There was no need to fill the silence anymore. The words had been said. Now, they could just breathe. Together. It started with the biscuits. Rosie had found the recipe in an old drawer, handwritten on a yellowing index card with faded blue ink. The name Allison was scrawled in neat cursive at the top. She didn't say anything when she showed it to James, just held it up like an offering, a quiet question. May I? James stared at it a long moment, then nodded once. That afternoon, the house filled with the scent of flour, butter, and something else, memory maybe. Rosie worked slowly, cautiously, treating each movement like it might unlock something she wasn't sure she had permission to touch. The biscuits came out lopsided and underbrowned. James ate 3 of them. Not bad, he said gruffly, wiping, his hands on a dish towel. Rosie smiled, radiant and small. I'll try again tomorrow. They didn't talk about Allison, but the biscuits stayed on the counter for days, and Rosie made new ones every morning, each batch a little better than the last. The town began to notice. Mrs. Carter from the bakery stopped by with a tin of cinnamon cookies. Just happened to bake too many, she said, though James couldn't recall her ever stopping by before. She smiled at Rosie, handed her the tin with both hands like a quiet welcome, and whispered, You let me know if you need anything for the baby. Sheriff Mendez passed by one evening, leaning on the porch railing while James fixed the loose step. Saw some kids snooping near your garage last week, he said casually. Thought I'd make a habit of swinging by. He nodded toward Rosie. Everything all right here? James just said, yeah. But he looked over his shoulder and saw Rosie in the window, holding a tea towel to her swollen belly, humming her wordless tune as the light from the kitchen spilled around her like a halo. Yeah, everything was more than all right. One day, Rosie asked if she could hang clothes out back. James had a dryer, but she liked the smell of sun on cotton. She used old clothespins and a frayed rope he hadn't touched in years. Shirts fluttered like flags of surrender in the breeze. He watched her from the workshop as she pinned up a blanket, her silhouette framed by the last golden burst of autumn. There was something about the quiet rhythm of her presence that made him feel, without warning, like maybe the world hadn't ended after all. That night, over soup and cornbread, Rosie said, "This house, it doesn't feel empty anymore." James sipped his coffee, eyes on his bowl. "You ever think," she continued softly, "that a house doesn't need to be owned to be home? It just needs to feel like someone wants to stay." He didn't answer, right away. Then, "I used to think it ended with her. That love, peace, everything. It all stopped the day she died." Rosie looked at him. Not to correct, not to comfort, just to listen. James met her gaze. "But lately," he said, "I've been thinking maybe it didn't end. Maybe it just changed shape." Rosie's eyes softened. "Like steam from a kettle," she whispered. "Still water, just transformed." James nodded slowly. "Yeah, exactly." Later that week, she asked about the spare room. James had cleaned it out quietly after she'd arrived, moved the boxes, dusted the windowsill, aired out the closet. "Was thinking," Rosie said, "maybe I could start sleeping there, just till the baby comes." James didn't ask why now. He simply brought in an extra pillow, fixed the loose bed frame screw, and carried in the rocking chair from the living room without being asked. That night, Rosie stood in the doorway of the room, one hand on the frame, the other resting on her belly. She looked around the space, then whispered, "It feels like a place someone could start over." James leaned on the wall beside her, arms crossed. "Maybe that's what it's for," he said. She turned to him. "You think places remember people?" He nodded. "And sometimes they wait for someone new." There was no talk of how long she'd stay. No promises made. But that week, Rosie started putting away the dishes without asking where they belonged. She left her boots by the door, her coat on the hook. She folded James's laundry when she did her own. And one night, she left a small drawing, just pencil on paper, on the table. A house with smoke curling from the chimney, a baby's hand reaching out of a window, and a tree, with 2 initials carved into the trunk, AJ. He didn't say anything when he saw it, just folded it gently and tucked it into the drawer where he used to keep his wedding band. Sunday morning brought snow flurries. Rosie wrapped a scarf around her neck and leaned against the porch post, watching the white specks dance. James brought her a warm mug and leaned beside her. "You ever name her?" he asked, glancing at her belly. Rosie smiled faintly. "Eden." He blinked. "Why Eden?" "Because it means beginning, and grace, and—" "I don't know," she said, brushing hair. From her face, it just feels right, like she's where everything starts over. James looked out at the white lawn, the trees bare but dignified. "You're not wrong," he said. And for the first time, he realized, this wasn't just a stop along her way. This was the beginning of something neither of them had dared to ask. For it was a Wednesday, the kind of gray, unremarkable day that passed without commentary in small towns like Fairbrook. James was under the hood of a '97 Chevy in the shop, humming low to the static hum of the radio. The door creaked open. He figured it was Mendez or maybe Mrs. Carter checking on her brakes. But it wasn't. The man who stepped in had swagger, even in the cold, hair slicked back, eyes too steady, the kind of face that thought charm could cover up rot. James didn't like him the second he spoke. "I'm looking for someone," the man said. "Young woman, pregnant. Name's Rosie." James straightened slowly, wiped his hands on a rag, said nothing. The man smirked. "Yeah, I figured. Word travels fast in towns like this." James's body stayed still, but something behind his ribs shifted, protective, ancient. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. "I'm her boyfriend," the man said too easily. "Well, ex, I guess, but I'm the baby's father. She ran off a while back, made a mess, but I'm here now, ready to clean it up." James stared at him a long time. "You should go." The man laughed. "You her dad or something?" "No," James said, "but this is my town, my shop, my house she's in. So yeah, you could say I've got a stake in it." The man's eyes narrowed, but his smile didn't waver. "You think keeping her here's doing her a favor? Come on, man. She's a kid. She doesn't know what she wants." "She knows she doesn't want you," James said flatly. Silence thickened. The man stepped forward. "Look, old man." James moved fast for someone his age, closed the space, not touching, yet, but close enough to change the air between them. "If you come near my house," James said, voice low and cold, "you won't like how I protect what matters." The man stared, measured, then smirked and backed off. "Message received," he said, stepping away. "But she's mine, you hear? And that baby too. Don't think this ends here." He left. The door rattled behind him. James stood still for a long time, the rag clenched in his fist. He didn't tell Rosie at first. He needed time to think, to calm the storm building in his chest. That night, they ate quietly. Rosie asked about the garage. He told her the truth, most of it. Just a stranger asking questions. Nothing to worry about, but he couldn't stop watching the windows, couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been pierced, its silence no longer sacred. 2 nights later, Rosie opened the door to find him standing there. The man, on her porch, smile easy, eyes empty. James was at the sink, heard her voice catch. "Why are you here?" Rosie asked. "Just wanted to talk," the man said smoothly. "Come on, Rosie. Don't be like this." James stepped between them before he could take another breath. "You need to leave," he said again. The man raised his hands. "Relax, old man. We're just talking." "You don't talk to people you've hurt like this," James said. "You don't get to show up and pretend nothing happened." Rosie's eyes were wide, her knuckles white around the doorframe. "I don't want to see you again," she said, her voice trembling. The man's face changed then, just slightly, the mask slipping. "You think this guy cares about you?" he snapped. "He's some washed-up mechanic with a martyr complex." James didn't answer. He stepped forward. Rosie said nothing, but her hand found James's sleeve gently. The man looked at them, at that quiet, steady gesture, and something faltered in him. For the first time, he didn't have the upper hand. "Fine," he spat. "You want to play family? Go ahead, just don't cry when it falls apart." He turned and walked off into the dark. James stood at the door long after he was gone. Rosie didn't speak. She just stood beside him, holding the side of her belly like she was trying to hold herself together too. Finally, she whispered, "I was so scared he'd find me." "You don't have to be anymore," James said. "Not here." She looked at him, really looked. "You don't have to do this," she said. "None of this is your responsibility." James didn't answer right away. But then he turned to her and said, clear and certain, "I know it's not my job, but I'm choosing to do it anyway." A long silence. Then, Rosie's voice barely audible. "Why?" James's throat tightened. "I thought I was done," he said. "Done with caring, done with hope. But you showed up and now, I can't not care. I don't want to go back to the way it was." Rosie stepped closer. "You're not alone in this, James," and she reached for his hand. He let her take it. That night, James slept in a chair by the front door. He told himself it was to keep watch. But maybe it was also to be near the only thing that made the house feel full again. It started with a sound, a low crack, then a pop. James woke in the chair by the front door, stiff and disoriented, the taste of adrenaline already in his mouth. For a moment he thought it was a dream, a ghost of that other night. 3 years ago, the last time he'd held Allison's hand, the last time everything burned. But this wasn't a memory. This was now. The light outside the window flickered. Not electric, but orange. Wild. Moving. He shot to his feet, opened the door, and the smell hit him first. Smoke. He turned toward the garage just as flames leapt up the side of the wall. Fast, greedy. Too fast. "Rosie!" he shouted, running back. Inside. "Rosie, wake up!" She emerged from the hallway, dazed, clutching her belly. "What?" "Get your shoes. Now." The heat was rising already, the fire moving along the dry side panel of the house. The wind carried it like a whisper with teeth. He grabbed the emergency bag he always kept near the entry. Flashlight, old medical kit, bottled water. He hadn't touched it in years, had never needed it. Until now. Outside, the air was thick. Orange lit the trees. The dry leaves they never got around to raking sparked like paper. "James," Rosie gasped. "The smoke, Eden. Just breathe." He said, taking her hand. "We're getting out." But as they reached the porch, the garage roof collapsed with a roar. The blast of heat was instant, searing. Rosie stumbled. James caught her. The weight of her body, the life inside her, suddenly more precious than every bolt and beam behind. "Them this way," he said, through the trees, down the hill. Behind them, the fire climbed the side of the house, curling upward toward the roof. Rosie hesitated. "I drew her first breath here," she whispered, shaking. "What if this is all we had?" James took her face in his hands. "You have me," he said. "You have today. And if I can help it, you'll have every day after." Then he lifted her, actually lifted her, and carried her into the dark. By the time they made it to the edge of the woods, neighbors were gathering. Flashlights bobbed. Sheriff Mendez's truck skidded into view. "Call the fire station," James shouted. "Get the medic. She's pregnant." Rosie was breathing hard now, hands clutching at James's shirt. Her body was trembling. "It's coming," she gasped. "I can feel it." James didn't think, didn't plan. Just laid her down on the blanket one of the neighbors tossed from their porch, shielded her from the wind, held her hand. She screamed once, then bit down, jaw locked. "James," whispered. "You're not alone." She nodded through tears. "Neither are you." And then it happened. A cry, not from Rosie, but from the world itself. Tiny, piercing, alive. Hours later, James sat on the steps of the neighbor's porch, wrapped in a borrowed flannel jacket, his hands still shaking. His house, his second chance, was a blackened shell. But Eden was in Rosie's arms, wrapped in a pink blanket someone from the community had brought without asking. She was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a full head of dark hair. Rosie looked up at him, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and awe. "She's here," she whispered. He sat beside her. He didn't speak. He just reached out and laid a trembling hand on the newborn's chest, felt the rhythm. Fragile, fast, real. The world had burned again. But this time it hadn't taken everything. This time something had been born from the flames. Later, when Sheriff Mendez walked over, James expected paperwork, questions, reminders of what was lost. Instead, the sheriff just nodded toward the crowd of neighbors still gathered nearby, bringing blankets, tools, warm coffee, and quiet offerings. "You're not alone here, James," he said. James looked back at the ruined frame of the house. "No," he said, "not anymore." That night, James didn't sleep, but not from grief. He sat beside Rosie and Eden in the guest room of Mrs. Carter's house. Loaned without hesitation, he watched Rosie sleep, her hand curled protectively around their daughter. Not by blood, but by bond. His eyes burned, but not from smoke. And when Eden stirred, tiny and bright in the lamplight, James whispered into the hush, "I would have done it again. Every time. For you." And he meant it, with everything left inside him. By morning, the fire was out. All that remained was a skeleton, charred beams, blackened nails, the faint scent of smoke stitched into the soil. James stood at the edge of what had been his porch, boots sunk in wet ash, his breath fogging in the cold air. There was no anger in him, just stillness, not silence, the kind he used to live in, but the kind that followed something sacred. Behind him, Rosie sat on a folded quilt in Mrs. Carter's living room, Eden asleep against her chest. The baby had slept through the night. Rosie hadn't. James hadn't either. They'd lost the house, but not each other. Not this time. By mid-morning, the town had already begun to move. Sheriff Mendez returned with coffee, maps, and a clipboard. "We're going to get the permits expedited," he said. "You just tell me what size you need." Mrs. Carter brought soup. The mailman, who had barely spoken 2 words to James in years, offered to help clear debris. The high school shop teacher stopped by with a truck bed full of donated lumber. "You'd be surprised how many people you matter to," he said, clapping James on the shoulder. James didn't answer. He just looked down at his hands, scarred, raw, the skin still tight from the heat. And for the first time in days, he felt them stop shaking. Rosie hadn't said much since the fire, but she moved with quiet purpose, rocking Eden, brushing soot from donated clothes, smoothing blankets with a kind of reverence that turned every gesture into prayer. James caught her once out by the blackened yard, staring at the place where the tree used to stand. She turned when he approached. "It's gone," she whispered. "All of it." He didn't say she was wrong, didn't pretend it wasn't true. But he bent down, dug his fingers into the earth, and scooped a fistful of scorched dirt into his palm. Then, without a word, he handed it to her. Rosie stared at it, then nodded. The next day, she planted a sapling, a thin, wobbly thing with 3 green leaves and a future no one could yet promise. She dug the hole herself, her knees in the black earth. Eden swaddled nearby under a patchwork umbrella. James helped settle the roots. They worked without speaking, only breathing. And when it was done, Rosie stepped back and said simply, "Promise, tree." James looked at her. "What's the promise?" She turned to him. "That we grow again, no matter what." In the weeks that followed, the house rose slowly from the ruin. Not grand, not fast, but sturdy, true. Neighbors came daily, hammered, nails poured concrete, left food on the porch without knocking. The pastor brought insulation. The barista from the diner painted trim on her day off. A retired builder named Hank brought a crib he'd carved himself, said nothing, and left before anyone could thank him. Rosie began sleeping in the house again before the windows were installed. James brought in a cot, and they camped in the living room under the open beams, stars blinking through the rafters. One night, Eden cried, and Rosie couldn't soothe her. James took her, awkward at first, but steady. He sang something low and tuneless, a hum from the back of his throat. Eden quieted. Rosie watched from the floor, her eyes wet. "You've got her," she whispered. He nodded. "I do." And he meant it. The new house wasn't perfect. The paint wasn't even. The porch slanted just slightly. The kitchen cabinets creaked if you opened them too fast. But when the wood stove lit for the first time and Rosie placed a photo of Eden above the mantel, just a Polaroid, blurry and off-center, it felt more complete than anything James had built in his life. He stood in the doorway that night watching Rosie place Eden into her crib. "You still thinking of leaving?" he asked, voice low. Rosie turned to him. "No," she said. I think I found where I'm supposed to be." James didn't say anything, but she crossed the room anyway, stood in front of him. And for the second time since the fire, she took his hand. Not because she needed saving, but because she knew he did. Outside, the promise tree stood alone in the yard, bare-limbed, stubborn, rooted, waiting for spring. By spring, the walls no longer smelled of smoke. The new house wasn't bigger than the one before, but it felt different. Every inch had been built with hands that cared. The floor still creaked in the same place by the stairs. The screen door still stuck, if you didn't lift it just right. But the quiet inside was no longer empty. It was full of footsteps, of giggles, of the soft, sighing hum of life in motion. Eden was nearly 6 months old now, fat-cheeked and full of noise. She had James's eyes, Rosie liked to joke, steady, watchful, a little suspicious. James never argued. He just looked at the girl, in his arms, and felt something he didn't have words for. Rosie moved through the house like someone who belonged. She baked most mornings, biscuits, now always golden. She'd learned to change out the stove filter and patch a loose floorboard. James teased her that she was becoming more handyman than homemaker. Rosie would smirk and say, "That's because I had a good teacher." Some evenings, when Eden had been put down and the kitchen was clean, they would sit on the porch and say, "Very little." James in his chair. Rosie curled on the steps. Sometimes her head would rest lightly on his knee, and sometimes his hand would find its way into her hair. It was never planned. It never had to be. That April, James finished repairing the old workbench in the garage. Not for himself, but for Rosie. She wanted to try wood carving. "Start small," she said. "Maybe blocks for Eden, or shelves, or little things that stay." He taught her how to sand, how to brace a corner joint, how to hold the weight of a chisel like a pencil, firm but never forcing. She listened closely, like she always had. One afternoon, Rosie came into the garage with a small wooden plaque in her hands. Burned into the surface, in carefully carved lettering, were the words, "Not because you had to, but because you chose to." James stared at it a long time, then looked at her. Rosie said nothing. She didn't need to. He took the plaque and hung it over the kitchen archway. Later that night, James stood at the crib, watching Eden sleep. She stirred, grunted, then settled. Her hand reached out reflexively as if searching for something that had never failed to be there. He reached in, laid a fingertip gently into her palm. She grabbed it, instinctively, trustingly. James didn't breathe, didn't move. He just stood, there anchored, chosen, tethered by something he never thought he'd deserve again. In bed, Rosie rolled to face him in the quiet. He was still awake. She touched his chest, just lightly, just enough. "I never said thank you," she whispered. James opened his eyes. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said, "but I need to." "But I need." He rolled to face her. Their foreheads touched, the space between them full of breath and warmth. "I thought I was broken," he said. "You were," Rosie replied. "So was I." "And now?" "Now," she whispered, "we build." There was no proposal, no wedding dress, no speeches. But that week, James took an old ring from the drawer, his father's, and left it on the windowsill in Rosie's room. She never mentioned it, but she started wearing it on a chain around her neck. The promise tree grew taller, leaves unfurled, green and stubborn. Its shadow fell just shy of the porch steps now. Eden sat beneath it in the mornings, clapping her hands at wind and birds and invisible joys. James would watch her from the swing he built into the porch beam, coffee in hand, the slow exhale of a man who had finally let himself exhale. Rosie would join him, press her hand over his heart, and stay. They rarely said, "I love you." They didn't need to. They were already living it. The sky was pink that morning, not the loud, fiery kind that split open the horizon, but the soft pink of peace, of something ending, gently. James stood on the porch, mug in hand, watching Eden toddle barefoot through the dewy grass. Rosie followed behind, her sweater sleeves rolled up, her hair in a loose braid that Eden kept trying to unravel with curious fingers. It was quiet, but not still. The house hummed behind them with the low rhythm of life. Dishes drying in the rack, floorboards creaking as the sun warmed them, the scent of bread Rosie had baked the night before lingering in the corners of the kitchen. James took a deep breath, not out of exhaustion, but because he could. That afternoon, they planted a second tree beside the promise tree. It was Rosie's idea. A place for her to sit in the shade when she's older, she said, holding Eden in her lap, showing her how the roots would go down, how the branches would grow up toward the light. James helped dig. The soil gave way easier now, softer. Ready? When they lowered the sapling into the earth, Rosie pressed a small stone beside the base, a river stone she'd found on the walk they took the day she told James she wanted to stay. Etched on it by her own hand were 2 words. We choose. Not forever. Not happily ever after. Just this. Now. That evening, Eden fell asleep in James's arms on the porch swing. Rosie curled beside him, head on his shoulder, her fingers lightly touching his forearm, tracing the scar there that no longer made him flinch. I used to think home was a place you had to earn, she said softly. Somewhere you only got if you did everything right. James looked at her. And now? Now I think home is where you're forgiven before you ask, and loved without needing to deserve it. He didn't answer, but he pulled her closer. The sun set slow. They didn't rush it. When the last light dipped behind the trees, James looked out toward the promise tree. Its leaves rustled, full and green now. The little river stone at its base caught a bit of that fading light. We choose. He looked at Rosie, at Eden, at the house that was not just rebuilt, but reborn. He had lost everything once, and yet somehow here he was, still standing, still choosing. And, in that soft silver twilight as the stars blinked one by one above the town of Fairbrook, James said the only words that mattered anymore. We'll be here. Tomorrow too. If this story touched something quiet in you, stay a little longer. Let every day be a new beginning. Let every home be a choice to love again. Some stories don't end with a kiss or a final goodbye. Some stories end with staying, with waking up every morning and choosing love, even after the fire, even after the silence. If this story found a quiet place in you, stay a little, longer, like, subscribe, and come back anytime your heart needs a place to rest.